Supposedly, there are towns that disappeared along with all their residents. Surprisingly, there are multiple legends of this in the United States alone. Towns that are nowhere to be found on maps, though people claim to have evidence for their existence. Still, the majority of people claim the stories are completely made up, though is there truth to it? The most well-known town alleged to have disappeared is Dovland, Wisconsin. There are no historical records suggesting the town existed, but there are enough people showing their souvenirs and claiming that they have relatives who used to live there to bring the possibility of its existence into question. It is said to have disappeared in the 1990s. Some speculate the town and all of its residents were the victims of a sinkhole or another natural disaster. Though, if this is the case, surely there would be several articles on the tragedy, and it wouldn't only exist in people's memories. Maybe not. I just learned there are several towns that have been destroyed by damming, more than you expect. One of the many examples is Elbow Woods, North Dakota. In 1953, a quarter of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation was submerged by the 200-mile Lake Sakakawea, the third largest reservoir in the nation, forcing 325 families to relocate. There are tens of thousands of towns in the United States. Towns sometimes get destroyed. Does it seem that outlandish that an unknown village in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, has no easily findable documentation of its existence and succumbed to a natural disaster 30 years ago? Some other speculations are that all the residents of Dovland moved away due to a failing economy. It could have been a military town that ceased to exist after operations ended, even that it was a failed government experiment, and the documents of it have been wiped. If the government really wanted to, they surely could make a small town of less than 1,000 people disappear along with all of its records if they really wanted to. Surely it would not be an easy task. And what even would the government experiment on with a town? Reminds me of the Netflix show Between that needs to be renewed for another season. Though at this point I have lost hope. So please suggest me other shows. I don't know about you, but these explanations seem a lot less likely to me. The precise speculated location of the town is unknown, though many who remember it say it was in the middle of the state. Some argue that the town and its residents have simply been hidden from view rather than having completely disappeared. Some evenings, it is allegedly possible to see the eerie silhouettes of homes and buildings in the mist. And on those nights, it is allegedly possible to hear the ghosts of occupants roaming the desolate streets. This, I must admit, is completely false. I have no idea who came up with that. One of the points of evidence that it did once exist is the people who have souvenirs they claim to have bought from the town, though a likely explanation of this is that they are bot-generated advertisements based on a user's search history. Also, anyone can make a cheap shirt that says anything they want. One person writes, I just learned of all the noise surrounding Dublin, and I think I can add some insight. Dublin was a small town in Wisconsin that housed a lot of military families. My father lived there for a year or two and spoke of it occasionally. The main thing I remember is that it had to do with Project Sanguine in the early 60s. I don't think it was X-Files type stuff, but the town was destroyed after an incident. I thought they were digging up a ton of land for something, and they flooded the town or something. But this is a rehashed second-hand memory from years ago, though I hope everyone knows this. Anyone can make up anything and post it on the internet as if it was a fact. The U.S. Navy suggested Project Sanguine in 1968 as a way to communicate with submerged submarines using radio waves of extremely low frequency. The initial system design called for a massive engine that would have covered 2/5 of Wisconsin and was built to withstand a nuclear assault. The intended system was never put into place due to opposition and possible environmental effects. Another person argues the locations for Dublin don't coincide with Project Sanguine due to the bedrock. There are 2 sites no longer in operation, with one being outside Clam Lake, Wisconsin, and another in the UP. These are extremely low-frequency transmitters that use the bedrock to bounce signals under the crust to signal nuclear submarines to surface to receive action messages. The antennas were above ground and looked like power lines running through the middle of the forest. If the antennas were buried, then they would short out to earth ground and be useless. I'm also an amateur radio operator, and this is second nature to me. There's nothing sci-fi about Sanguine and nothing that could cause an accident where a town would disappear, but there have been studies about the possible increase in cancer due to the power and frequencies used at that site. Another says, as someone who has lived in various places in Wisconsin for over 30 years and has been in the Army, never once has any single person ever mentioned Dublin, though this was disputed by someone saying, I think you made a good point, but Dublin was very real. My father used to mention it occasionally before he passed, and the only reason I remember it is because I found it ironic that a town named Dublin was populated by almost exclusively military personnel and their families. I will dig around for a shirt when back home in early September. If I remember correctly, the town was built as part of Project Sanguine in the mid to late 60s. Maybe everyone left when the project was canceled, but I thought something went very wrong. You can only dig up that much turf for so long before you're bound to have problems. The freaky bit is how many people in my family from Wisconsin say they remember Dublin. There is a photo of a group of people that was supposedly recovered from Dublin, though I do not know where the picture is from or who originally posted it. There is a similar town from Wisconsin that no longer has any inhabitants due to flooding, Werner, Wisconsin. You can see where objects are submerged on Google Maps and the township map in 1878. However, it is simple to locate references to a town that was submerged as a result of a river being damaged and the subsequent flowage. Dublin is only mentioned in relation to conspiracy theories. A Reddit user whose username is a big black dude did 9/11 suggests that Dublin is simply confused with Sullivan, an actual city in Wisconsin. As a dyslexic, this is absolutely a reading mistake that I would make. Another user suggests that there are plenty of towns that die out due to simply just people moving away over time. Though if this was the case, certainly there would be records. Perhaps the entire town and all of its records shifted into another dimension, and the only thing that remains is people's memories or a Mandela effect. There is an article. More than 1,000 Wisconsinites reported as missing, though this is not from a very reputable source. Once we get into the outlandish theories, it seems more and more unbelievable. I like to think the most likely explanation is the case that it was a little-known military village, or that a village didn't have many documents to validate its existence, and it was destroyed by a natural disaster. Seems to be in the realm of possibility, though the most likely explanation is that it never existed, and the story is fictional. If we are thinking realistically, a town that disappeared in the 1980s or 90s doesn't exist. Cullen Hudson, the creator of the website Strange State, revealed in 2015 that his mother had received what appeared to be a historical summary of a town in an email. In the beginning of the 1930s, in Herkimer, Iowa, for years, no one gave the bustling town of Herkimer much consideration as they went by. Many people even drove through it, and there are rumors that transactions took place between tourists and the Herkimerovians when aerial images of the town in 1928 revealed only empty fields, where there should have been residences, streets, and shops surrounded by farms and grain fields. The first doubts regarding the town's existence emerged. A few weeks later, a lost tourist stopped at a gas station to refuel, but when he drove 2 miles outside the town, he found that his tank was empty. He turned around and walked back to demand a refund from the cunning gas station, though the town continued to be ahead of him, no matter how far he traveled. Fortunately, another driver picked him up after a few hours and filled up his car with fuel, but the man had been thoroughly frightened and needed a lengthy stay in a psychiatric hospital. Both of these stories were published in a 1928 issue of a real city's newspaper, Davenport, Iowa. If the story had not been published in the same issue of the newspaper as the crash of the Wall Street stock market, there undoubtedly would have been a strong public response. A loud complaint was made in the following week's issue by a woman who claimed to live in Herkimer, Miss Fatina Morgana, contesting the town's alleged non-existence and recounting her experiences there as a school teacher and anti-saloon activist. But the commotion around the closures of factories obscured her letter to the publisher. The Herkimer newspaper released the headlines, "Rumors of our non-existence have been greatly exaggerated," for which they were sued by Mark Twain's estate. Throughout 1930 and 1931, Herkimer remained undisturbed, although there was minimal traffic now, and most of it was by horse-drawn wagons, as farmers attempted to salvage their old homesteads by traveling to larger cities to sell their crops. Passersby still waved at kids playing in backyards as they drove on Route 41. However, tragedy occurred in 1932 when a convoy of Illinois farm families making their way to California from the destruction of their Dust Bowl fields chose to camp out at night near Herkimer. Two of these individuals took the little money that they had and walked into the town to buy supplies. Entering cities was never without risk, as travelers were thought to be thieves and were not welcomed by townspeople. The men walked to the general shop, stopping briefly to check the gas prices at the outside pumps before going inside. They were shocked, discovering they couldn't climb the stairs leading to the store, with their feet reportedly passing through the bottom step like a cloud. They attempted again using a nearby old board, convinced that this was some sort of scheme to keep outsiders from purchasing at the business, though they were unable to walk on the board as well. Fearful, the men fled back to their camp to tell the others what they had seen. They were accused of wasting their hard-earned funds on alcohol rather than beans and bacon. They were able to show they still had the money, urging the others to try. A dozen armed men returned to the general store, witnessing the same unsettling experience. The group promptly put out their fires and left. But word of the incident spread, and soon a group of state police were called to look into the situation. They went to the Herkimer Sheriff's office. The sheriff approached the guardian of the peace's office and made an attempt to knock on the door, only to have his hand mysteriously pass through the door. With each passing day, the structure of the town became less solid, and onlookers observed the absence of children playing and the deteriorating condition of buildings. When an immigrant farmer named Phineas Bump passed by in 1932 at dawn with his load of crops, he was bewildered to see nothing. There were only abandoned fields and decaying fences where the town once was. The only sign that humans have settled here was a cast iron tub that had once served as a livestock watering trough, alone in the field of weeds. Herkimer had vanished completely after the disappearance of the town. A group of nomads camped there for years. The group's leaders told a councilman for a neighboring city that the area was saturated with the tears of the dispossessed and with the despair of those who had never borne names. Cullen claims in the first telling of the tale that he thinks it is a made-up legend, possibly one meant to be shared through email, like others in the early 2000s. The first mention of the story was in 2015. It's likely it was never a legend in the 1930s. Without providing this information, the story was quickly reposted on Mysterious Universe and other websites. The Davenport newspaper mentioned never existed. All evidence points to this story being a pure internet legend that was first told on one page and then repeated on other websites that were more interested in a good story than actual facts. Langville, Montana was a small rural town that allegedly disappeared in the early 2000s, and where online discussions and evidence were apparently deleted, appearing in a Google search autocomplete and suggesting search options under interesting titles such as Langville, Montana Incident, Langville, Montana Disappeared, and strangest of all, Langville, Montana Turned Inside Out. But after clicking on these links, the search returned nothing, leading the researchers to suspect that not only was the city gone, but all information about it had been wiped from the internet. The story became internet legend and was later referenced in a recent Ghostbusters sequel.
Sheriff in New Mexico reports a UFO encounter. The crew of the SS Orang Medan dies mysteriously. The entire town of Langville, Montana goes missing.
It does. Okay, but Pete, we're talking about relocating. No one's being killed here, right?
They were turned inside out.
Skin is on the inside of their body?
Their skin is on the inside of their body because their organs are on the outside.
But they're okay, right?
Sure.
I think they're dead.
On that horrifying note,
while it is likely that some type of publicity campaign was involved in the proposed search, some locals have claimed that rumors of a lost town in Montana have been around for a long time, while others claim to remember Langville, albeit only vaguely. After the movie's release, residents of Montana would leave reviews referencing the town as a real place, though they could have done it ironically. Possible explanations for the story include a hoax or publicity stunt for the Ghostbusters movie in which it was mentioned, a true lost city, either exterminated supernaturally or by conspiracy. The mysterious and eerie tale of Ashley, Kansas, and what became of its more than 670 citizens following an unusual incident in 1952 has been making the rounds on the internet for a while. It's an intriguing story when it comes to inexplicable occurrences. After weeks of weird events, there was a nighttime earthquake. Afterwards, the town of Ashley and everyone who lived there vanished without a trace. But you won't find much information on Ashley, Kansas in historical sources. Such a town is not depicted on any maps from the time period and is not listed on any census data. Sometime during the night of August 16, 1952, the small town of Ashley, Kansas ceased to exist. At 3:28 a.m. on August 17, 1952, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake was measured by the United States Geological Survey. The earthquake itself was felt throughout the state and most of the Midwest. The epicenter was determined to be directly under Ashley, Kansas. When state law enforcement arrived at what should have been the outskirts of the farming community, they found a smoldering, burning fissure in the earth measuring 1,000 yards in length and approximately 500 yards in width. The depth of the fissure was never determined. After 12 days, the statewide and local search for the missing 679 residents of Ashley, Kansas was called off by the Kansas state government at 9:15 p.m. on the night of August 19th, 1952. All 679 residents were assumed to be dead. The next day, at 2:27 a.m. on August 30th, 1952, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake was measured by the United States Geological Survey. The epicenter was situated at the same location under what used to be Ashley, Kansas. When law enforcement investigated at 5:32 a.m., they reported that the fissure in the earth had closed. In the 8 days leading up to the disappearance of the town and its 679 residents, bizarre and unexplainable events were reported by dozens of residents in Ashley, Kansas, and law enforcement from the surrounding area. A user on Creepypasta Wiki published what was probably the initial draft of Ashley, Kansas story in March 2012, meaning the story and the town are a work of fiction. In 1952, Kansas experienced just one earthquake, and it happened in April rather than August. A magnitude 7 earthquake striking Kansas would have gone down in local, if not national, news, much less 2 such earthquakes occurring at the same location within 2 weeks of one another. However, there is no such record of such a geological phenomenon, and even if, in true conspiracy theory fashion, the authorities had worked to hide whatever allegedly occurred in Ashley, there would still be evidence of the town's existence in other writings, maps, and documents dating back to 1952. Helltown is a neighborhood in Summit County, often known as Boston, Ohio. Unlike the other towns I have mentioned, it is actually a real place, though its existence is surrounded in mystery. According to local lore, the region is haunted and home to Satanists as a result of the vacant buildings left behind by the widespread eminent domain seizure of nearby properties during the establishment of a park. These tales are typically regarded as folklore. Boston Village was established in 1806, and it seems to have thrived up until 1974, when Gerald Ford signed a measure allowing the National Park Service to establish a national park in the county. The National Park Service purchased a number of homes on December 27th with the intention of demolishing them. Some of the dwellings remained standing for years before being demolished. They were boarded up and designated as government property. There were rumors that the government was attempting to cover up a chemical spill. Others, particularly visitors, were unaware of the eminent domain procedures and thought the abandoned structures were part of a long-standing ghost town. The village is still there today, but some of the homes are boarded up because the National Park Service bought them and the residents moved out. However, the park has preserved the majority of the homes. A few have been destroyed. The National Park Service's discovery of toxic waste in 1985, when a hiker in the park fell ill after touching something coming out of the rusted drums at the abandoned dump, which is near the town, may have sparked rumors of the chemical spill. The nearby Boston Cemetery is said to be home to a lonely ghost that does nothing except sit on a bench with an expressionless and lifeless face. Additionally, there are claims that the trees act haunted. Many people think that that's just one of the many things the satanic organization, which casts evil spells all over the place, has created. According to legend, a children's school bus broke down in one neighborhood, and a bunch of demonic serial killers savagely the bus driver, and the many children traveling. Many people frequently hear the children's ghostly screams. A church is said to be protected by an evil man who resides in the cellar. He never interacts with regular people, although he frequently hosts rituals. There with the building's owners who worship the devil. It is allegedly filled with crosses that are turned upside down and has perpetually blazing candles that can be seen even at night. Urban explorers and ghost hunters have become interested in the deserted settlements after discovering odd lights, orbs, and voices. According to another legend from the cemetery, the only spirits that are not required to leave the regions are the deceased, who remain in this deserted ghost town and search for their long-lost families. In the front of Helltown is a ghostly school bus. According to one legend, it was intended to transport high school kids on a ski vacation, but an elderly woman hailed it down and told the bus driver that a young boy in her home was gravely injured, but it was a trap, and a serial killer went after all the students. In a different telling of the tale, Satanists were responsible for the students' sacrifice, though it is probably just an abandoned bus. According to myth, if you look out the bus windows, you can either see the killer's spear or the ghosts of the victims who are still inside the vehicle. The peninsula python is a mutant snake formed from the landfill's hazardous waste. On June 8, 1944, Clarence Mitchell saw an 18-foot snake slithering over his cornfield close to Peninsula, Ohio. A group that had been organized on June 25th failed to locate any evidence after searching for many days, other than broken branches and tracks leading to a river. Valley neighbors, including Pauline Hopko, who claimed the snake slithered away from a willow tree in her yard and alarmed her cows to the point they bolted, reported seeing the enormous snake up until August 1st. Honestly, nothing seems more terrifying than an 18-foot snake, and I don't even have a phobia of snakes. But good for the men trying to hunt it down. I would simply just move away. Portlock is at the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, a town that has disappeared, and only a few rotting houses remaining of the once vibrant village. The area was settled in the 1780s. The town survived until everyone left in 1950, and most of the inhabitants moved to a nearby village on the coast. All of the remains of Portlock is the mining tunnel, the piles of the house, and the rusted equipment of the can factory. According to local lore, an unexplained furry creature attacked and chased villagers, murdering them and leaving their bodies until everyone left the area. Residents of nearby villages also say that there are ghosts in the area. Portlock became known as one of the scariest places in Alaska. Many are afraid to visit this area because unexplained circumstances kept happening in this small town. In 2008, it was reported that all the workers walked off the job at the cannery because of the mysterious thing haunting the camp. The canners returned the following season, but unexplained incidents continued to be reported. An atmosphere of fear and mystery prevailed the small town. Hunters headed for the mountains, and gold miners began to disappear. In 1931, a man chopping wood was found deceased, apparently by a single blow that seemed more powerful than a man could withstand. This worried the townspeople. A group hunting moose reported finding giant footprints tracking the same animal. They arrived at the scene of the bloody battle, and the moose was nowhere to be found. From this location, footprints of over 18 inches long went into the Misty Mountains. Such cases began to appear regularly. The creature is called Nantinak, half man, half animal. A resident saw a huge hairy man breaking fishing reels on the beach. He had ran back to get his weapon, and when he came back, the animal just looked at him and left. With these observations, riots began to increase in the city. The corpses washed from the rivers into the lagoon, and strange wounds that no bear could have done. The loss of their lives affected the small community, and there was fear. People started leaving due to the unexplained disappearances and murders. No one could risk living there. Residents took off in 1949, leaving behind their houses, a nearby chromium mine, a tin factory, a teacher's cabin, and a large schoolhouse to return to the desert. This left Portlock as an abandoned Alaskan town that many people never wanted to return to. Only the postmaster remained. After only a year, the post office closed in 1950, and the last remaining resident of Portlock left the city. Even the postmaster couldn't keep up with this town. The town went through more than 50 years of hauntings and disappearances before the townspeople gave up and left. Portlock remains largely uninhabited to this day. The city was discontinued as a census town in the 1980s and has not been reported since. However, there are visitors from time to time. In the 1970s, a fisherman forced to flee a storm reported that something strange walked on two legs in their camp. This frightened them, and they left as soon as possible. 70 years after the ghosts began, it was still going on when people visited the area. The founding of Roanoke County was Sir Walter Raleigh's attempt to establish the first permanent English settlement in North America. The colony was first established in 1585, but after only 5 years, when a ship visited the colony in 1590, the colonists disappeared without explanation. The colony is later known as the Lost Colony, and the fate of 121 inhabitants remains unknown to this day. Upon arrival, visitors found the colony deserted. The mysterious word Croatoan was found carved into the palisade, which they interpreted to mean the colonists had moved to a nearby island of the same name. Speculation that they merged with the nearby Native American communities appears in writings. An investigation of Jamestown settlers yielded accounts of Roanoke settlers being harmed by Native Americans, but no conclusive evidence was found. There was no sign that the men had ever been there except the bones of one man who was believed to be one of them, although they were unable to be found. In 1590, a report suggested that they could have simply moved and might still be found alive. As long as the settlers could not be proved to be deceased, related colonists could legally maintain claim of Virginia. Despite this, an application was made in 1594 to declare Ananias Dare legally deceased so that his son John Dare could inherit his estate, which was accepted. On Raleigh's first transatlantic voyage in 1595, he claimed to be looking for his lost colonists, although he later admitted that this was misinformation that obscured his search for El Dorado. On the way back, he sailed past the Outer Banks and later claimed that the weather prevented him from landing. When returning to the colony in 1590, there was no sign of battle or forced retreat. Although the place was forfeited, No human remains or graves have been reported in the area, suggesting that everyone was alive when they left. The Croatoan message is consistent with their agreement to tell them where to look for them, suggesting that they expected the other colonists to look for them and wanted them to be found. They could have also succumbed to disease or starvation or have been victims of a storm. Though this is just a speculation and still no one knows where these colonists went.